There we go. I hope I'm audible, sir.
Oh, more than audible. Yeah.
Oh, great. Namaskar and a good evening to all joining us from New Delhi and different parts of India. And a very early good morning for Professor Ganguly and some of others who are joining us from the US and also from different parts of the world. I'm Manish Dabhade here, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Indian Futures and also faculty in CIPOD SIS JNU. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset, as I always do, introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. We are a New Delhi-based independent media organization that started out in January 2016 with the sole aim to creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, as the PM in fact reminded us all yesterday during his address after unveiling the statue of Swami Vivekananda in JNU. The ideas of New India in all their very dimensions and contestations. The idea is to go beyond the headlines of the day and have a honest, deep dive conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. The idea is to organize, probe, stimulate, and at times provoke the innermost mind on a contemporary theme of critical relevance to India. We are extremely proud to have hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. For example, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, President of ICCR. We had BJP General Secretary, Shri B.L. Santosh, Shri Ram Madhavji, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, who is currently the Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was recently, till recently, the Foreign Secretary of India, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, Professor Sri Raju, Professor Makkar Paranjpe, and Rajdeep Sardesai are just a few I've named here. We are truly delighted to host this very special and in fact can you please mute yourself? Yeah. Is this clear, sir, now?
Yes.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this. We are truly delighted, in fact, to host a very special timely session of utmost significance for most world capitals, be it New Delhi, Tokyo, Beijing, Tehran, Pretoria, or DC itself. And this is really the TIF town hall on Biden presidency, implications for India and the world. So we now have Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., President-elect, who will assume office on the 20th January 2021 as the 46th president of the US. And in fact, he just will be turning 78 just a week from now on November 20th. Joe Biden's essay in the Foreign Affairs, Why America Must Lead Again, can easily be seen as the first reference point, a first draft of sorts to start out. What will US strategy be under him, as distinct from Trump, what he calls rescuing US foreign policy after Trump? Let me now start out by laying out a template of sorts on Biden presidency that in fact have been largely agreed upon by most decision makers and political pundits, analysts throughout the world. First and most important, a deeply polarized, a tribalized and divided America. In fact, George Packer, in his, one of his latest pieces in The Atlantic, calls it two countries. And this is now also coupled with COVID pandemic and the economic woes. And these are also not just COVID, but even structural economic woes that raise a big question mark on the ability and willingness of Biden to lead the world. Second, and the most important, obviously, on Trumpism. Will Trumpism, both domestic and in international avatar, outlive Trump now with Biden at the helm? In fact, many argue convincingly and persuasively that Biden is an aberration of sorts. Trumpism is very much alive and will be back roaring in 2024. On Asia, Beijing looms large. So how does Biden go about shaping the strategic competition as distinct from confrontation as Trump did? I think that there are very real structural constraints of geography, of economics that have already kicked in even during Trump's period. Trade skepticism, another area. I mean, in the US, it is now bipartisan. Coming to India, other than the obviously the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris connect, what exactly is India and how is India going to figure in the Biden scheme of things in Asia? Again, very limited by India's hedging strategy and at times this a sort of diffidence also with the Quad, which we can also witness, though there is upgrading happening all the time, but still there are actually really no straight answers to each of these big questions. And fortunately, I don't have to answer them. But we have assembled the best possible cast of foreign policy giants who can give us some very definitive answers to each of these questions. Each one of them is known throughout India and the world as very authoritative, very sharp, very incisive, drawing from years of experience and intellectual curiosity. Leading them all is Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, a 1973. Please keep yourself muted. This is requesting you again to please keep yourself muted. Team Indian Futures, please ensure that others are muted. Sorry about this. Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, she's a 1973 batch Indian Foreign Service officer who served as India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011. She was also being India's ambassador to US and China, extremely significant and prestigious assignments for an Indian Foreign Service officer. And obviously, another significant tenure as High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. I distinctly, in fact, remember her as an MA spokesperson during the Vajpayee years, 2001-02. In fact, that was when I had just opened up as a student in JNU to the world of international relations and Indian diplomacy. Truly honored, Ambassador, to have you with us today. We also have with us Professor Amitabh Mattoo, who is my senior colleague and professor in my center, in our center, CIPOD SIS, and also a professor of IR in Melbourne. He has also been Vice Chancellor of University of Jammu and a cabinet rank advisor in the Jammu and Kashmir state government. He also heads the Indian Association of International Studies and has headed the Australian Indian Institute, New Delhi. Great to have, as always, with us, sir. Professor Shumit Ganguly, who also joins us today from US, is a distinguished professor of political science and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Ganguly is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a member of the CFR, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also an associate editor of international security and serves on the editorial boards of Asian Security, Current History, Foreign Policy Analysis, and most importantly, the India Review, the non-proliferation review, of course. He is a specialist, as we all know, on contemporary politics of South Asia and a widely read author, co-author and editor of over 20 books on the region, published by very prestigious publication houses, Yale University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Oxford University Press. I'm so honored and so obliged that you join us today. The non-proliferation review, of course. Professor, as we all know, on contemporary politics. Yep. Professor Swaran Singh, another senior colleague of mine and a professor of diplomacy and disarmament and currently chairperson of CIPOD SIS, as we all know, is a globally recognized expert on China, very much in demand in various media outlets these days, thanks to our Chinese friends. He's also the president of the Association of Asia Scholars and has several scholarly books and articles on a range of IR issues to his credit. I'm so delighted to have you join us today, sir. In fact, I should mention here that he has joined us just as a day-long MPhil PhD Vivas have ended for the day just 45 minutes ago. So it's great, despite his, very taxing day he had today, he happily joined with us today. Without any further ado, yeah, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Without any further ado, I now invite Ambassador Rao to make remarks, as we had agreed, for about 10 minutes or so. on largely what will be the upward trajectory since, in fact, which we have seen since late 90s, where in fact she has been not only a witness but a driver too in many ways, a very significant actor in as a official in the MEA, and in fact, which has also been testified by what Ashton is called in his foreign affairs essay, the surprising success of India-US partnership under Trump and Modi. Will that really hold under Biden? Over to you, Ambassador Rao.
Thank you so much, Manish, and it's an honor to share this platform today with such distinguished fellow panelists as Professor Mattoo, Professor Swaran Singh, and Professor Sumit Ganguly, who I have known for more than 3 decades now. You spoke about the upward trajectory in relations between our two democracies, India and the United States, after the election of former Vice President Joseph Biden to the presidency of the United States. And of course, his ticket includes Kamala Harris, the first woman to hold the post of vice president. And what has caused a lot of excitement and hope and positivity here in India is the fact that she is of Indian American heritage, as also of Jamaican heritage through her father. So these are exciting, momentous times. This has been an election watched all over the world. The United States is the leading democracy in the world, and so many of us have been inspired by the story of the history of the United States since the late 18th century when it gained independence from Britain. But the last 4 years have, to put it diplomatically, been quite an exception to the rule. And various questions have been raised about the strength and the resilience and the direction of American democracy during the presidency of Donald Trump Jr. As they say, it ain't over till it's over. There are still questions that have been raised and seemingly unreasonable and completely refutable questions raised by the Trump, by those around Mr. Trump and supporters, most surprisingly, within the Republican Party. It is amazing and an issue of consternation to all of us around the world as to how the party of Lincoln has become the party of Trump. But experts say that this questioning of the results of the presidential election are unlikely to go anywhere. First and foremost, there's very little evidence that the naysayers are bringing forth to the courts to suggest that there has been foul play in the election and things have to be reopened. So let us hope for the best and look forward to Joseph Biden being sworn in as President of the United States on the 20th of January, 2021. As you mentioned, Manish, this upward trajectory that we're all looking forward to at a time of COVID, at a time when the world has been faced with an unprecedented situation, perhaps a situation that we have not faced since the end of World War II, this pandemic and the fact that all over the world, we seem to be rowing in the same sea, even if we are in different boats. And the United States particularly has been sort of mowed down by the effects of the pandemic, hundreds and thousands of cases every day. And the neglect of science and a scientific approach in dealing with this situation has literally created a near disaster situation in the most developed democracy in the world, which is truly an American tragedy. But I hope, as they say, there are second acts in American lives and the situation improves. And Mr. Biden has said his first priority is going to be the pandemic and dealing with the situation within the country. He's already set up a committee of experts to look into what can be done about the situation. There are hopes of a vaccine coming into the market very shortly. All of us around the world, I'm sure, are heaving a sigh of relief about it. So coming to the priorities of what Mr. Biden's presidency will be defined by, it seems that, and from all accounts and his statements, that his vision will be turned inwards because there is so much to be done within the United States to set things right, especially with the pandemic situation and with improving it and ameliorating it, because the economy, which has been quite struck down by the effects of the pandemic, is not going to look up until this situation is addressed. So, and then there are issues like race relations, and the fact that Kamala Harris has been a prosecutor, a very successful prosecutor in her previous career in California before she became senator, the reform of the criminal justice situation. There are great divides, great canyons that divide people in the United States today, a distinct polarization that has never been seen before. And Mr. Biden faces a formidable task in healing America and bringing it together again. Whether, as some say, this is going to be an impossible task, and in the next, after 4 years, we'll see Trumpism rear its head again, we really don't know. Today, I saw a report that if Kamala Harris were to stand for the president in 2024, she may well be opposed by another Indian American, former permanent representative, US permanent representative to the United Nations and governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley. So it'll be two Indian Americans pitted against each other. Times, as Bob Dylan says, are a-changing. So coming to the foreign policy priorities of the Biden administration, Mr. Biden, Mahesh, you referred to his article in the Foreign Affairs magazine. We all saw his 60 Minutes interview. He speaks of bringing America back to the head of the table. He says leaders should set their level of ambition, and that he wants to repair the alliance relationships that have been somewhat wounded during the Trump years. He wants to build partnerships. He wants to, of course, address the issue of China. China, and then Russia. He said Russia is a threat and China is a competitor. And I think there will be a blend of competition, perhaps some cooperation, and yes, even confrontation in the US-China relationship as we see the years ahead. I don't believe that the tensions in relations between the United States and China will go away. That they will continue, but the Biden approach, I believe, will be more nuanced, less ideological. We won't hear the constant refrain, the chorus of referring to the People's Republic of China as this entity called the Chinese Communist Party. That kind of McCarthyist language perhaps may be dropped, but the general direction of relations with China and the fact that the levels of engagement and cooperation that we saw up until the end of the Obama years will be a thing of the past. Mr. Biden will not have the luxury of restoring that level of relations. So it's not going to be entirely a restorationist foreign policy, as people have said. There will be areas of reform. Issues of trade, people say that America, the people of America really don't occupy themselves with foreign policy issues. In fact, foreign policy was hardly an issue in this election. But I believe that, at least from recent works that I have read, that issues like trade and immigration certainly occupy the minds of people within the United States also. And if Mr. Biden is going to improve trade relations between America and the rest of the world, I don't believe he will really go the tariff way, but he will be looking for increased market access. He will, in fact, when it comes to government contracts within the United States, will source American manufactured goods and services. He wants to create jobs within the country. When it comes to India, we must all remember that Mr. Biden has a long career of experience in the field of dealing with the outside world from his years as senator, 48 years as a US senator, and part of that as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was one of our main cheerleaders within US Congress when the civil nuclear deal was being negotiated. And even before, after the Pokhran nuclear tests in the late 90s, he was somebody in the Senate when we faced sanctions from the United States. He constantly emphasized the need to have a strategic perspective on relations with India, that India was not a rogue state like North Korea, that India needed to be treated differently. And in fact, it's from that period, really, this resurgence in US-India relations dates. He was one of those voices who sensed the importance and the need for that strategic direction in the relationship. As Vice President, he came to India, as you all remember, and again, a very sober, reasoned voice when it comes to relations with India. People say that a Biden presidency, by virtue of his own experience and the fact that he's a decent individual with a very humanistic vision, it's quite possible that issues of democracy, issues of treatment of minorities, the issue of the situation in Kashmir, people say that these are all subjects that will occupy his attention. Whether they will be a cause for divergence in a strategic partnership between India and the United States, I don't believe that will be the overarching assumption that we should adopt, that relations between India and the United States are going to be affected by these new angles in the relationship. By and large, that will occupy. I think there's an echo. I don't know what the reasons for it is. But let me say that the relationship between India and the United States has grown steadily. There's been a continuum. There has been a consensus across the aisle between the Democrats and the Republicans about the need for better and better relations and the indispensable partnership with India, which was a word that was coined during the Obama years. During the Trump years, people have spoken about the relationship that was fostered and assiduously cultivated between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. Somebody called it Mr. Modi's disarmament strategy vis-a-vis Mr. Trump, that it was necessary for him to cultivate this relationship, knowing the fact that you never know what the next tweet from Mr. Trump will say. He recently, of course, terminated the US Defense Secretary by tweet, as we all know. So that kind of uncertainty in the relationship and the fact that perhaps a certain direction was lacking should we all expect go away during the Biden presidency that awaits us. I think I have perhaps outrun the 10 minutes that I have to speak. Mahesh, please tell me if I have. But I will stop here. Maybe there will be opportunities to discuss and elaborate on some of these issues as we go forward in this webinar. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Ambassador. I think that was a very insightful understanding of where the relations are headed. And obviously, you rightly pointed out the internal challenges for Biden, obviously. And again, making a very important point about that we are not definitely going to see a restorationist foreign policy. That I think was a very important point. And again, you rightly reminded all of us about the historic role role of Biden in really promoting India-US relations, especially in the tumultuous years after the 1998 nuclear test. But very importantly, his role in the pushing the Indo-US nuclear deal in the US Congress. I think that was fantastic. With this, now I request Professor Amitabh Mattoo to really give his initial remarks, and as we had discussed on how actually India is seeing the Biden presidency, and obviously it started out with Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, and now we have landed in Ab Ki Baar Biden Sarkar. So how does India really look at it, sir? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manish. I must say I'm delighted and honored to be in this stellar company and to follow, especially Ambassador Nirupama Rao's incisive remarks, but also to be in the company of my dear friend Shumit Ganguly, who I'm seeing after a long time virtually, albeit, and Professor Swaran Singh. I really almost completely agree with Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Of course, I can probably say it with less diplomatic finesse, given the fact that I'm an academic. But let me focus on 3 or 4 areas which you have flagged. One is the transition. Second is Biden's domestic agenda. third is Biden and the world, and finally bilateral relations. I, for one, really was delighted that Biden had won the election. I believed in the great common sense and decency of the American people, although I'm still surprised that so many people voted for Trump. Perhaps Shumit can tell me why. Because I believe that there is a certain sense of American exceptionalism, which is an exceptional quality to recognize what's good for the country. And I believe that for all one may say about Trumpism, Trump and Trumpism is an aberration. Even though you might have had 72 million people vote for Trump, even though you have had this nexus between toxic populism, which mobilizes the urban white working class together with a plutocracy, I think these are aberrations. These are aberrations at a difficult time in American history. I think what Biden needs to do is not fall a prey to believing that this is inevitable, that America is divided and it can't be healed, that you cannot build bridges to ensure that America leads from the front again. For that, I think it is one inspiration, and I've said this a number of times, and I wonder why there aren't enough people talking about it. The inspiration is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the person who rebuilt America after the Great Depression of the 30s. It was FDR who had a program which addressed the social divisions, which addressed the economic dismal conditions, which addressed the political divisions through a program, multi-pronged program of relief, reform, and recovery. Now, obviously, the conditions that operate today are different from the ones that operated in FDR's time. You have a pandemic, you have ethnic division, racial divisions of a kind that you haven't seen since the 60s. You have America almost at war with itself. But unless a president recognizes and realizes that his mission, as Biden has said, is to unite America, the task will seem impossible. And he has to act on multiple fronts to do this process of healing, and from day one. The challenge, of course, is that even now, and again, I will defer to Shumit unless to whatever he says, but the challenge is that Trump is not going gently into the good night. He is out there like a Samson, out to destroy all the temples of the Philistines because he feels betrayed by some illusion of a Delilah in the American people. So how do you ensure that there is a smooth transition? And while you have, as Ambassador Rao pointed out, the defense secretary being sacked, what we have been told, and these might, I hope, Shumit will tell us that these are all conspiracy theories, that the Pentagon is being stuffed with all sorts of crazies. Now, this is happening in the United States of America. I am shocked. But let's assume that on 20th of January, Trump doesn't do anything which will demean himself, which will demean America more than what he has done in the last 4 years, and we have a peaceful transition, then clearly Biden has the agenda of healing America, rebuilding America. Fortunately, you had good news on the vaccine front. Pfizer has announced a vaccine which is in the latest evidence suggests a 90% efficacy, which most people say, and I'm not a scientist, say is good enough. Now, if that does translate into action, then by the end of the next year, hopefully the pandemic will be behind us. The recovery of American economy, the rebuilding of America as a melting pot in that old traditional sense, which some people thought was in some ways trying to demean identities, but in that old-fashioned sense is extremely important. Finally, of course, I think as far as Trump and the world goes, frankly, anyone who's been observing foreign policy will again have have had a sigh of relief that every morning you didn't have to begin, or at least you'll have to do that every morning till the 20th of January morning, begin with seeing what the real Donald Trump has said today. Who is he going to bomb? Who is he going to sack? Who is he going to dismiss? And what is he feeling like that morning? Because that's what American foreign policy had been reduced to. The whims, the fancies, the idiosyncrasies, the eccentricities of one narcissistic individual. On the contrary, Biden, you might say, has more gray hair, but he's much more collegial. He will govern, if you have to compare corporate America with the way the presidency is going to be governed, as head of a well-run board of a well-run company. He'll be collegial, he'll delegate. And with that delegation, with that collegiality, will come a certain predictability. With Trump, there was no predictability. Today, he was talking about meddling in Kashmir. Tomorrow, he was talking about how Imran Khan was his best friend. Day after, he would talk something which was completely different from what he had said a moment ago. Now, that reliability and predictability is so essential, whether it's in a tax regime in your own country, but when you have the president of the most powerful nation, the most powerful executive person on this planet, not being predictable, that's a highly risky situation for the world. So in Biden, you'll have collegiality, you'll have reliability, and with that comes a certain sense of responsibility. Trump had responsibility to only himself. His personality was so narcissistic that anyone who reinforced that narcissism was his best friend. And therefore, he saw the world through his own image, which needed to be bloated up constantly. I mean, it's not the right thing for us, even as academics, to comment with such degree of superciliousness about America. And I didn't think that in my lifetime it would come to that. But Shumit will agree that there are times when academics have to be blunt and honest if they have to keep up with their own intellectual conscience and as decent, good human beings and as global citizens at the end of the day. So what that reliability will mean that the allies will breathe a sigh of relief, the European allies, all the other partners. Multilateralism will get a fresh chance, not in the kind of weaponized Chinese intrusive form, but a chance at trying to save the world where there are issues of global common interests like climate change, whether it's trade, whether it's pandemics, whether it's the WHO, WTO, or the Paris Accords. That will get a second chance. And finally, there is no way that any American president today can deny the fact that in some ways Xi Jinping is the greatest possible threat to the United States and the world since Stalin. I would say that even Mao, even given his role in China, and of course, we await Ambassador Rao's forthcoming book, after which we can perhaps review I can at least review what I've said. But since Stalin, and the trouble was that you had a Stalin on the other hand and someone like Donald Trump on the other hand. What you require is strategy. What you require is working with partners and allies to contain China. And I'm not using the C word. I'm not being coy about using the C word. For far too long, and that's where the Democrats need to realize they thought that liberal institutionalism, that socializing, embedding China into multilateral institutions will moderate their behavior. That strategy simply hasn't worked. China has weaponized multilateral institutions to their own advantage. And Biden doesn't have the luxury of choosing America's partners. The Quad, the democracies that exist in the region, the countries like India, Australia, Japan, are their natural partners, not just because they have the right, they have similar values as America, but also because there's a clear and present danger, and there is a convergence of interest regarding that clear and present danger. Finally, is the bilateral relationship. Anyone who believes that it was a wrong strategy to play to Trump's narcissism, because that's what we were doing, doesn't understand diplomacy. Obviously, in a democracy, you do that. If you have to engage with the United States, and the United States is ruled by someone who will only who will only give you attention and time and understanding, if you say, "Oh, it's ugly bari Trump sarkar," sure enough, that's what diplomacy is about. But Joe Biden has been in the business of understanding democracy, has been a senator in the Congress for the last 40 years to know that these are constituencies that you have to appeal to. These are not governments who are necessarily acting with a long-term strategy in place. If you have a president and there is a certain slogan which appeals to him, you go out and perhaps use that slogan. In other words, I think the relationship between India and the United States, and I would echo that as far as echo what Ambassador Rao has said, is far too important for both countries. It's not just that it's important for India, it's equally important, if not more important, for the United States, for it to be undermined by Trump's relationship with Prime Minister Modi, or one little irritant, and there will be irritants. Like every good friend, like Shumit and I would disagree on 100 things, but we would still have a bonding, which means that even after not seeing each other for 13 months, we'll catch up like old friends do, because there's much more common between us than what divides us. And that's what's important in between India and the United States. There's a diaspora of 4 million, and all surveys suggest primarily voting Democratic. There is the China factor. There's a huge trade relationship. You need to look at supply chains which will use the Indian manufacturing as a hub. There are all sorts of possibilities, and then you have the Quad. So I am confident that no matter what happened between Trump and the Indian leaders, it's not going to undermine our relationship. And let me finally, Manish, since we have a great audience, let's also flag SIS and JNU. Now that we have also in Washington, D.C., one of Foreign Secretary Rao's juniors, who's a dear friend, Ambassador Taranjit Singh Sandhu, right there, working the Hill, and we know that he will ensure, as well as all the other factors, that our relationship stays steady and stable in the next 4 years to come. And more power to Kamala Harris, because I believe that she has a capacity to really be the first woman president of the United States. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Mattoo, for really brilliantly sketching out in 4 specific ways. You talked about transition, you talked about domestic arena, obviously the international agenda, and then obviously the US-India relations, and obviously the focus of Biden, how it is going to be healing, rebuilding of America, rather than targeting friends and foes alike. Also, very important point which you said that, which in fact Ambassador Rao also flagged, was that this whole predictability, reliability, how important that was to the conduct of international diplomacy. I think that was a brilliant point which you both made. And I think many are in fact rejoicing with the fact, especially internationally, that okay, Biden is not Trump. I mean, I think that is a very good starting point for many decision makers around the world. Thanks again. With this, I now invite Professor Shumit Ganguly to really tell us how US grand strategy plays out under Biden. To what extent will it be same or distinct from Trump? Over to you, Professor Ganguly. So please unmute. Yeah. So please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manish, once again for inviting me. In the first place, this is a unique opportunity, and it's an absolute delight to be amongst friends whom I have known for decades, as Ambassador Rao pointed out at the very outset, and as also Amitabh underscored, and Swaran I've known also for a very long time. So none of the panelists are strangers to me by any definition. And we have already heard two literally masterful presentations which have covered a considerable amount of ground. So I don't need to repeat what the two panelists have said, because I am in near complete agreement with every statement they have made. There's very little daylight amongst us, given the precision and the nuance with which both the two previous speakers addressed the subject. I will primarily confine myself to American policy towards Asia, and more particularly towards India, since I'm addressing a primarily Indian audience. And this is a subject I have written about previously and expect to write more in the foreseeable future. At the very outset, the first point I would make is that a degree of pragmatism and common sense will characterize Biden's foreign policy towards India, rather than the vagaries, to use Amitabh's word, that characterized Trump. That on a particular morning he woke up and it dawned on him, a particular idea dawned on him, and then he promptly tweeted it out without consulting the National Security Council, without consulting his Secretary of State or his Secretary of Defense. And then they were left to scramble and explain his completely, again to use Amitabh's word, utterly eccentric and idiosyncratic remark. That will not happen. Furthermore, Biden has assembled a superb South Asia foreign policy team, people who are professionals, people who are knowledgeable about the region, who will advise him, and hopefully some of them will actually find significant positions within the array of bureaucratic slots in the government, many of whom come from outside government, which is typical of any American administration. And this time it won't be major donors and the like, and personal cronies and business associates who will populate this administration. Instead, it will be populated by a range of professionals, many of whom have significant South Asian knowledge and expertise. So one can expect a pragmatic, informed foreign policy towards Asia and India. Second, there will be a degree of policy continuity. Despite Trump, a number of individuals within his administration ensured a degree of rationality and common sense that pervaded Trump's foreign policy, despite the man at the helm. Not because of him, but despite his best efforts. The bureaucracy acted as a certain kind of ballast, which ensured, particularly where India was concerned, that certain policies that had been initiated under Obama and even earlier were not abandoned. Consequently, you saw continued weapons sales to India. You saw the signing of important foundational agreements, which had been initiated under Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter. Those were continued. Efforts to engage India in the Quad, which had begun under Secretary Carter, were also continued. So that continuity, mercifully, will continue, will persist under the Biden administration, and the band of cooperation will be significantly expanded, not simply focused on weapons sales, but a wider engagement with India on a range of issues, many of which were neglected at the cost of primarily a defense relationship under Trump, and largely a transactional defense relationship with no sort of intrinsic interest in India, despite Modi's best efforts to cultivate Trump. But given the president's narcissism, given the president's self-obsession, there were limits to limits to any astute move on the part of Modi to cultivate him, because this is an individual who is totally consumed by his own interests, and interests defined extremely narrowly and in a most parochial fashion. All one needs to do is read his niece's book, Mary Trump's book, who is a trained psychologist, to understand the nature of this deep-seated narcissism that characterized the behavior of this particular president. And while questions still remain about his departure, in the end, to use Amitabh's phrase, he will, to quote Dylan Thomas, he will have to go gently into that good night. Even though it may not be gentle, he may go kicking and screaming into that good night, but he will go into that good night. And on the 20th of January, we will have a new and sane president once again, who will restore a degree of common sense and decency and civility to both American life and to the conduct of American foreign policy. One can expect a Biden administration to bolster India's capabilities against an increasingly assertive PRC. He will continue to work with India on the Quad, and he will urge India to pursue to invest more significantly and more fully in the Quad. There's little or no question in my mind. So my second point is, in certain areas, particularly when it comes to policy towards China, there will be a significant amount of continuity, but bereft of the rather crude language, the ineptitude that characterized diplomacy, the idiosyncratic nature of diplomatic outreach on the one hand, warming up to Xi Jinping and then being utterly dismissive of him almost within the span of the same week. You will not see that kind of utterly idiosyncratic behavior that characterized the previous administration. On the other hand, you will see a saner policy which will see China as a competitor and seek to limit Chinese assertiveness, but without the use of intemperate language while he goes about that endeavor. The third point I'd like to make is that the administration will seek to resolve a series of outstanding trade issues with India, but without acrimony or without unpleasantness. That one can disagree without being disagreeable, I think is what's going to characterize the relationship with India. There will not be the same kind of peak and attempts to expand the market for Harley Davidsons in India, which barely employ 500 people here in the United States. But he did this largely because the Harley is a symbol of American greatness amongst many of his followers, his so-called base. And that's what he was cravenly appealing to. Not that the sale of a few Harleys on an annual basis would make a significant dent on the trade relationship between India and the United States. One can also visualize a degree of sanity when it comes to the H-1B visa issue, which again, he was a form of shameless pandering to his base, who thought that Indian professionals were taking their jobs in droves. Never mind that the professionals we are talking about are highly qualified individuals for which there are not enough Americans to fill those jobs. So much of this rhetoric was basically bereft of substance, but had considerable appeal to a certain segment of ignorant Americans who constitute his political base. So once again, one can expect to see a degree of reasonableness when it comes to the very vexed H-1B visa issue, and Indian corporations, major corporations which have a multinational presence and a significant presence in the United States, will breathe a multiple sighs of relief in the foreseeable future. We can also visualize cooperation with India on the development of a vaccine, on the distribution of a vaccine against COVID-19, and cooperation also on the extraordinarily tendentious issue of climate change, on which Trump completely dropped the ball. Or by the 21st of January, I can visualize a Biden administration rejoining the Paris Accord, committing itself once again to combating climate change, engaging India and even China possibly on the issue of climate change. Consequently, I think there is the possibility of a return to a multifaceted relationship which the Obama administration had ensured over almost a decade while it was in office with India. Despite Obama's initial neglect of India, he more than made up for it over the course, particularly of his second term. Though it started in the latter portion of his first term, by the second term, there was a full-blown engagement with India, firing on all cylinders. One can easily see a return to that, despite the preoccupations that both the previous speakers have pointed out, that will require a certain amount, domestic preoccupations that will consume a certain amount of time on the part of a Biden administration. Do expect a fairly robust engagement of India and not a treatment of India along purely transactional lines as the previous president was known for. Fourth and finally, and this is a point that both speakers have made in passing, but I will address it more directly because this will be of interest to an Indian audience, given that both the president-elect and the vice president-elect during the campaign brought this matter up. One should not expect it to be swept under a rug or a carpet once they are in office on the 20th of January. And that is the very delicate issue of the treatment of minorities in India and the question of India's various decisions on Kashmir in the recent past. This is a contentious issue in Indo-US relations, but I do not expect either the vice president or the president to engage in public grandstanding, as took place at one point under a certain assistant secretary of state during the Clinton administration, which caused unnecessary heartburn in New Delhi and understandable heartburn in New Delhi. I had a ringside seat to this because I was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. when that particular storm broke in the Washington Post that morning. And so I'm more than well aware of the disaster that Robin Rafel set in motion. I cannot visualize something similar happening under a Biden administration because it is going to be, as I have argued earlier, laden with professionals who have a nuanced understanding of India and the subcontinent and are unlikely to make such a careless, intemperate remark. However, quietly, firmly, one can imagine that there will be some discussion of this rather delicate and rather trying issue in Indo-US relations, because both these individuals have important domestic constituencies, including amongst Indian Americans who care deeply about these issues, and they will respond to these pressures. That said, I still visualize and will insist upon the fact that there will be civility, cordiality, and common sense that will characterize the bilateral relationship as Biden assumes office, along with Kamala Harris on the 20th of January. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Ganguly. You've been extremely economical, very brilliant, very crisp, and obviously, the major points obviously was that U.S. under Biden would be pursuing a very pragmatic, a very informed, as you said, and a very reasonable foreign policy. And coming to India, a very important point that it will not be a defense and a transactional relationship, which seemed, which was in fact in major ways during Trump, to a much more broad-based, to a much more multifaceted level of diplomatic interface between India and US. Thanks again. With this now, I request Professor Swaran Singh to address us. In fact, in many ways, all the discussions are really about the big elephant in the room, which is China. So, and I couldn't have thought of any other person than Professor Swaran Singh to really navigate. What exactly is China up to in many ways? In fact, China only today, after a full week, recognized or congratulated Joe Biden on being the president-elect. Over to you, Professor Swaran Singh.
Thank you, Manish. Let me also share the sentiment. I'm delighted to be part of this very esteemed panel for this discussion. I agree with you that in all the three presentations, directly, indirectly, China was a factor in how both the coming of Joe Biden or India-US relations and the trends that they have had or will have are viewed. So China remains, as you said, the big elephant in the room. Incidentally, this election also saw China becoming a major issue between the two presidential candidates, each trying to pose who is tougher compared to the other on China. Of course, which was partly because of the pandemic, which US has crossed 10 million figures of infected people. So that could have partly exacerbated that repeated consciousness of rise of China. But I think it is also true that it's constant rise of China and the assertive policies that China has had, especially under President Xi Jinping, that both United States and India see increasingly shared interests to come gradually closer. So as a result, we have seen in about 15 years now, there is increasingly strengthening of constituencies that want to ensure US and India stay in closer partnerships. We have had bipartisan support to this building of closer relations. We now have a relationship fairly institutionalized, which then should make it relatively autonomous of the China factor, but China factor nevertheless remains really critical. Second point that you mentioned is that China, of course, after waiting for almost a week, only today, recognized that Joe Biden is the next president of the United States, congratulated. But we can still know that, Ambassador Rao has spent time in China, studied China for a long time. The nuances, it is the foreign ministry spokesperson who makes a comment. It's not yet a direct telephone call or a message from President Xi Jinping or even Prime Minister. So they took this time is not anything strange. It's not an aberration. It doesn't really necessarily should be seen as a standalone case. Chinese are usually extremely cautious in sort of making any formal statements or commitments. You can remember India's on nuclear tests and the letter that Vajpayee wrote to Clinton. Chinese took their time to respond to these things. They can then, of course, come upon very heavily, use harsh words sometimes. But this delay was very calculated. As all three speakers have mentioned repeatedly, this unpredictable, whimsical Trump tweets or statements. And Chinese, even after this closure of Houston consulate, stayed very, very careful in not allowing Trump to really go berserk with all kinds of new statements. So they were taking extreme caution to make sure that President Biden, now to be designated President Biden, doesn't come under that enormous cloud, because already, Chinese scholars are saying that the fact that relationship has been built, in such brinkmanship over the last 4 years, it's not going to be easy for Joe Biden to really, walk back from there. He will have to continuously sustain that and gradually manage that into sort of building certain kind of partnerships where he can, and of course put coercive tools or diplomacy to restrain China where he must. So that's what his article in Foreign Policy talks about. China, we also said, is a competitor. It's Russia that is a threat. So what Chinese are saying now is that return to democratic presidency is not going to fundamentally change the equations. Indeed, in some sectors, in some manners, relationship would become more competitive. And in some other ways, it would perhaps become relatively easier. And then three speakers have mentioned about the predictability issue. So it could become perhaps a little more predictable in that sense for the Chinese. What Chinese media also is quoting various experts, is how, compared to President Trump, very unpredictable, whimsical, harsh, this is going to be indeed more also, this one, the Joe Biden presidency, is expected by the Chinese to become relatively more effective and efficient in pursuing national interest of United States, and in that sense influencing China's responses too. So it's going to be relatively tougher to manage Joe Biden for the Chinese than they thought it was to manage President Trump. So that sense is very clear on the Chinese side, if you read the responses that they are making so far. So in that sense, they see, if you look at the big picture, challenges for China increasing actually. And that is because we have all heard that he's willing to again go back and build, sort of those alliances that were kind of at this certain discomfiture with President Trump, and even engage China where he can in that sense. So it's going to be much more nuanced way of bringing what could be called engagement, which is engagement and containment of China, which could perhaps be much more difficult for Beijing to tackle. But how is Beijing thinking in tackling Joe Biden is also important. So they may have had more difficult challenges, less difficult challenges as far as United States leadership is concerned. But then if you go back to, very famous book of 1990s, Cultural Realism by Ian Johnston, it's an imperial civilizational DNA, which, is integral to Chinese conduct of foreign policy again. Very strange ways sometimes. I remember reports about Ambassador Rao was being called at middle of night to Foreign Office, which was seen as an aberration in India because she was the first woman ambassador of India to China. So it was read very differently in India. Right from Mao's meeting with Khrushchev, or, more interesting, the fact that Nixon, actually Henry Kissinger had to first undertake a secret visit to China in July of 1971, unannounced, unreported, unknown, followed by a full week-long visit by both Henry Kissinger and President Nixon to a country with which they had no diplomatic relations. And it's a very interesting picture that most of us have seen of Mao sitting on the couch and Nixon bowing down to shake hand with Mao. Of course, explanation is that Mao was not keeping good health. And so many interesting interpretations of that meeting of how the Secretary of State, William Rogers, was not part of the 3-member team that met Mao. And that was the first meeting as they landed in Beijing. And indeed, a special assistant of Henry Kissinger. We all remember that Winston Lord was one of the 3 people who met Mao. And in fact, all his pictures from the media had to be cropped to remove him being seen visible, because that would embarrass the Secretary of State. So how Chinese have orchestrated and they underline these symbolisms and visible sort of gestures that they make very often to treat themselves. One could go back even to the imperial times of Qing dynasty, British ambassadors showing in the court, and the way emperor talks to the messenger from British Queen, and the way those conversations take place. That imperial mindset in that sense is not disappearing and is not going to disappear. So an interesting episode of Nixon's visit does not end there. In fact, if you see, the next great episode was Tiananmen Square of 1989, when that was the lowest ebb of US relationship with China. And of course, George Bush Sr. at that time was someone who was, I think, one of the rare presidents of the United States who had a good understanding on China. And different stories go back to saying that he had accepted a much lower position in embassy in China, while he was being offered to be sent to Europe for much higher positions. So he was interested and understood China. And in Tiananmen Square incident, within June, 4th of June is the episode of massacre. Within June 29th, National Security Advisor, we all remember, Brent Scowcroft, undertakes a secret visit again in a cargo plane unmarked by any insignia of military, I think C-131, reaches there and gets audience only on 2nd of July. So Americans have understood how the Chinese would be engaged, and Trump was completely out of sync in understanding how Chinese have to be dealt. And I think if we think of American presidency coming back to normalcy in that sense, we will see some of these very interesting equations happening, because Xi Jinping is no different. It's not only that, Deng Xiaoping made Scowcroft come in that flight all the way to Beijing, unannounced, undeclared secret visit, while formally they were at best stopping all formally announced visits. So George Bush understood China, and he was not completely stopping relationships with Chinese, and he undertook this very interesting back-channel diplomacy. Xi Jinping, first foreign tour that he takes is to Latin America. And what happens on his way back, he sets up a meeting with President Barack Obama in Sunnylands in California. So President Obama flies all the way to California to have a meeting with President Xi Jinping. So what I'm underlining here is that if we are assuming that there is going to be a very nuanced, interesting way of tackling China with the new presidency of Joe Biden, those interesting episodes of history tell us that Chinese are not going to really be any different. They will still find ways of engaging relationships with the United States. Does that mean that could perhaps make India relatively less important? If relationship between Washington, DC and Beijing becomes predictable, manageable, does it reduce India's relevance in that sense? Or does it mean that we will see that we are in a very different era? China is very different. Post-pandemic, China is all the more different. They believe they have come out of the pandemic. They're going to really become the largest economy in current dollar terms, maybe tomorrow, or maybe already they are. And they think that economic prowess can be, transformed into political influence. And that could perhaps make Joe Biden much more conscious and perhaps confrontationist. Is that because we are also hearing the comments made during election speeches on being more tough on issues of Hong Kong, on minorities in China, but that's also true in case of India. So very often when we make an assessment, we believe that election speeches are not necessarily meant for building foreign policy with other countries. They're largely meant for domestic constituencies in that sense. So if China engagement becomes much more predictable, manageable, and does it reduce India's significance? And does that therefore increase India's China challenge for us? That is something which we have to really seriously think, because we, as I said, have institutionalized bilateral relations, have of course also bipartisan support. But is it that the rattling of relationship between United States and China was something that was pushing India and United States coming and inching closer much faster? Would it reduce that speed of engagement between the two countries because foreign policy is relatively stable? At least Chinese definitely think in that fashion. They think if their relationship with the United States becomes far more manageable, predictable, then they will have to worry less as far as India is concerned in terms of standing next to United States, and therefore becoming a matter of concern to the Chinese. Most Chinese do not believe India is a country of concern to them, other than the fact that we are inching closer to United States. So that is the assessment Chinese have again, that if they are able to build bridges of certain kind and make their relationship with Joe Biden, the presidency, much more manageable, then they will be automatically managing the relationship with India as well, and will be less worried about what they do with India. That is my assessment, and let me stop here. I believe we'll have questions and comments later, and in case there are comments or questions to me, I'll be happy to step in and also add on more on this subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Singh. I think that was very insightful assessment, and a very fair assessment in some ways about how China actually looks at the incoming Biden presidency. Other than the very many important points you made, I think the most important obviously was that not many realize or acknowledge the truly autonomous nature of India-US ties, which in fact Ambassador Rao also pointed out to, but I think you flagged it for the benefit of all of us. And coming to China, I think a very important point which you said, that ultimately there is some realization in China and in Chinese strategic minds that Biden or no Biden, in that sense, there is going to be a continuity in US foreign policy in terms of what many call congagement. So I think that's a very important point. And obviously, many lessons of history, many episodes you pointed out where exactly Chinese were very smart and had a very agile, nimble diplomacy where they could really reach out to US in much more effective ways. And obviously, this is also where structural factors of being a great power, economic size really matters. So I think that was brilliant. With this, I think what I've done is, since we have just about 15 minutes left to conclude the session, I'm looking at the questions in the chat box, and also in the YouTube conversation, and also other questions which we have been getting on Twitter. I have just there are 2-3 questions, and you can all maybe some of you can come in. Please feel free that you want to take this on. The first point obviously is, sorry, to what extent, and in fact, which is also flagged out by me initially, that it is a divided America economically. Obviously, recession is in full flow. Pandemic still remains a big challenge. In that sense, to what extent will that affect how allies, how friends, and how foes, how Tehran would see it, how, for example, China would see it. How do you see that playing out over the next couple of years? So maybe we can start with Professor Ganguly, who could say how these deep internal divisions are really going to maybe constrain American foreign policy choices. Professor Ganguly, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Manish. My suspicion is that these divisions will not be healed overnight, that they will remain because you have a highly aroused political base which has already refused to accept the outcome of the election, and they will continue to agitate and they will continue to distract the Biden presidency. But I think that will not cripple American foreign policy. That may create a diversion or a distraction for Biden and members of his cabinet, but it will not fundamentally undermine the conduct of American foreign policy. And there is, speaking of Iran, I think there is a fair likelihood that Biden may well try and resurrect the JCPOA with some modifications. He will certainly restore the relationship with NATO, which has become significantly frayed. He will, and this is where I have a minor disagreement with Swaran, that while the relationship with China is likely to become more predictable, I don't think the competitive element that characterizes the relationship will come to an end. That competition is structural and has to do with China's dramatic rise and growing assertiveness and China's ability and willingness to impinge on significant American interests in East Asia and beyond. And consequently, even though Biden is not prone to making intemperate or careless or feckless remarks, nevertheless, that element of structural competition will remain, and consequently, while day-to-day tensions might dissipate, the overall relationship will not fundamentally change. And so to tie up the threads, yes, a divided America is most unfortunate, and it is something that preceded Trump, which he allowed to come to full flow through his rhetoric and his actions. But these divisions have existed previously in the United States at historical junctures, and it didn't prevent the United States from still straddling the world like a colossus. And I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. These attempts to think that America is a crippled giant is a foolish notion that I have seen repeatedly undermined over the course of my own professional career.
Great, sir. In fact, this is where, in fact, Professor Swaran Singh can also come in. So one of the big ideas of Biden is to really have a global coalition of democracies, or maybe a summit of democracies. So how would that really play out? Because at some level, it is very exclusionary. To what extent will that be seen by China, sir? How would China react to such a, because that would really be solidifying, I mean, a Cold War sort of situation. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Those of us who have dealt with China understand that Chinese believe that they have a democracy of their own kind. So they don't believe that they don't have a democracy. And therefore are often, sort of agitated by the fact that sometimes democracy is used to sort of build up, consensus or collaborations which are supposed to put some restraint on China. You can remember for last 2 decades, at least, China has been one of the very vocal countries to talk about democratizing international relations. So they think they are also for democracy in that sense, and feel agitated why democracy should be slapped upon them as something that they don't have, and as if others are kind of sacred countries with democracies. So any call of democracy is seen by China, whether it's a democracy fund or democracy coalition or anything of that. Democracy as an adjective is seen as aimed at containing China. We, of course, often say it may be at best meant for restraining China. But let me, as an academic, also mention this, that democracy has become fashionable in last century. Also partly because this is the most vulnerable political system that one can devise, which allows major powers to go influence, arm twist, dictate policies in democratic countries, not in countries that do not have democracy. And Trump's falling in love with Kim Jong-un is a good example of how it is difficult to influence non-democratic countries. So in that sense, it is both. The fact that promoting democracy would increase influence that United States can build around the world. United States can also use that as a campaign and a tool against their major competitor, as we are saying. Joe Biden himself says China is a competitor. But when American analysts look at competition in especially several sectors, like for example, in high technology, 5G, for example, or in even other areas of research and development innovation where China is putting a lot of efforts, it by implication becomes national security threat. Though Joe Biden doesn't believe that China is a national security threat, he's said it very clearly. So in that sense, yes, democracy as a slogan will be very helpful and has been very helpful to American presidents one after another. And if it is used, it will definitely be alarm bells, ringing for the elite in Beijing.
Great, sir. Ambassador Rao, if I can come to you, if you've seen the last couple of months, that there is maybe some chorus, maybe some sort of, in fact, all of you have alluded to that, about India's domestic politics. To what extent do you see that as a challenge for India's diplomacy? And since you were also posted in the US, how does US different constituencies, how do they see it, and how does that affect shaping of the American policy vis-a-vis India?
Thank you, Manish. Before I answer your question, I'd like to just segue into China a little. I think we all must remember that regardless of the fact that you have a new president and Mr. Biden is a polar opposite of what Mr. Trump has been, and his approach on foreign policy will be so much more rational, pragmatic, and much more easy to relate to and comprehend for the rest of the world. But let's also not forget that he equally, like Mr. Trump, regards China as a special challenge. And he has pointed to the fact that China is playing a long game, that China has indulged in unfair trade practices, that it has indulged in technology and intellectual property theft. So all these, indices for the definition of China's policy to the outside world is shared equally by the Biden administration. So, and when they speak of China as a competitor, and how do you define competition? It could be military competition, it could be economic competition, it could be technological competition, and technology is the big 800-pound gorilla in the room today, and it's going to occupy a lot of the foreign policy concerns of countries around the world who deal with China and who have to be looking at alternative systems of what they are able to develop, since it's all understood that things like 5G from Huawei could pose a national security threat. So I think that Mr. Biden also regards China as a national security threat. He may not have spelt it out in such graphic detail, but it is there. It is the underlying concern, and it is where I think they will build coalitions of interest and alliances of a strategic approach to China. Now, coming to the issue of domestic situations occupying frontal space in foreign policy, Professor Ganguly Sumit, I think, elaborated on this, and he said that even if issues like Kashmir and minority treatment of minorities, these contentious issues will be of concern, continue to be of concern to Mr. Biden personally and politically. There will be no public grandstanding on these issues, because I think overall the India-US relationship transcends politics and personalities. And so there will be that strategic convergence that will continue to be maintained and further developed. Now, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, I believe that vision for the Indo-Pacific, where the US is a central player, but is is able to build coalitions of interest with other like-minded democracies. Professor Swaran Singh referred to the Summit of Democracies. But here in the Indo-Pacific, I think people talk a lot about the Quad, the Fab Four, as it were, Japan, Australia, India, the United States. But the Quad is not a military alliance, and the US is going to look to giving special attention to its alliances in Northeast Asia with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Taiwan. These are where I believe understandings will be especially cemented. And for India, the China challenge being what it is, I believe, the external balancing that we want to build and strengthen and consolidate further will continue under the Biden administration. And I believe the strategic dialogue between the two countries on China, the 2+2, for instance, will continue to have a life of its own. But as Professor Ganguly said, I think there's been a certain narrowing of the arteries, as it were, in the Trump presidency when it comes to just the focus on defense and security. When there is a larger relationship, there is a larger garden that needs to be tended. And that is where the strategic dialogue that was launched by Hillary Clinton and Mr. S.M. Krishna in 2009 looked at so many facets of human endeavor when it came to India and the United States. And I think that is also something that probably the Biden administration will pay some attention to with some areas of reform.
Great, Ambassador, and thanks for really also talking about Indo-Pacific, because that was also one of the questions which I had in mind. We now come to the last part, obviously, with Professor Mattoo. Sir, to what extent you think, Professor, the Kamala Harris, because there's obviously there's an India Connect, and at some level it is also raises high level of expectations from Kamala Harris as the Vice President. So how do you see that? Because now you also see media nitpicking on what she has said about either the state of democracy in India or in Kashmir. So how does that really play out, from the Indian point of view?
Manish, I believe that the Kamala Harris story is a compelling story. It's a compelling story of the Indian dream and the American. The fact that her mother, from a small town Tamil Brahmin girl, goes to University of California, Berkeley, on a scholarship, makes good, marries a Jamaican, and brings up these two daughters as confident Black women who succeed in America. I think that's a great story. Now, you have also to realize that Shyamala Gopalan, their mother, had her political rite of passage during the great civil rights movement. It's a civil rights movement that was inspired by leaders like Dr. King, but also by Mahatma Gandhi. It's part of our common heritage. It's about what Gandhi did in America, in South Africa. It's about what Gandhi did in India against the British. So let's not be defensive about civil rights, about healing, about empowerment of minorities. Every democracy goes through phases, and there are groups which become marginal, and to fight for their rights is what all good people do at various times in their history. Kamala Harris has a bonding with India. Of course, the kind of embodiment of that bonding is our common friend G. Balachandran. But more than that, she identifies with her grandfather. They used to take walks down the Adyar beach in Chennai, and they have that memories, and those play a part. I mean, however much realists or would like to kind of clinically take away a part of the brain which thinks or emotes, fact is that there is that sentiment. Now, will Kamala Harris decide her foreign policy or her advice to President Biden on the basis of that sentiment? Quite clearly not. But she understands India. We don't have to explain India to her. As we didn't, on the other hand, as Shumit pointed out, here you had someone like Robin Raphael, Assistant Secretary, who served as a political counselor in the American embassy, had been feted by the Pakistani embassy and Kashmiri separatists, and then decided that the accession of Kashmir was disputed on a first off-the-record press conference, and she got the job because she was a friend of Bill. Now, Kamala Harris comes from a different narrative. Here is someone who becomes a DA in California, who becomes the Attorney General, becomes a senator, and throughout that period, she maintains that link, that connection with India. You read her autobiography. In fact, the two autobiographies on this program, if I would recommend, is Kamala Harris's, and on the 17th, you have Obama's first volume coming in, and that, of course, is much more revelatory, but there are parallel stories of two immigrant stories who offer a compelling case for both America, but also a powerful reminder of how we stand by the same values. And that's what Trumpian transactionalism, what Trumpian maverick realism taught you, was that a relationship divorced by any sense of common purpose will ultimately reduce itself to a farce. I think Kamala Harris, given that she's a heartbeat away from the presidency, brings that sentiment, but brings a cerebral energy to the relationship. So I wouldn't think that she will change her ideology or that she will be less concerned about civil rights, but she will bring that understanding that India is a nation which is a nation in many ways in the making, that we are building a nation which is more inclusive. And she will understand all our problems and faults because she's seen it. It's been part of our common heritage. I think give me a Kamala Harris who might be critical of India as a friend than someone who doesn't understand and is dismissive about India like a Richard Nixon.
Great, Professor Mattoo. I think we have just overshot ourselves by 5 minutes. So I now move directly to the vote of thanks by Bhavna. Over to you, Bhavna, for a formal vote of thanks.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Manish. Let me begin by profusely thanking a truly special and stellar panel of speakers who joined us today. Ambassador Rao, Professor Ganguly, Professor Mattoo, and Professor Singh. Each of you brought your truly high, world-class expertise to the table and enlightened us all with your very engaging remarks and responses. Knowing your very tight intellectual engagements, we are indeed delighted that you could make it today evening and make it a memorable one. I also wish to thank all participants who joined us on Zoom today, but also many who joined us via YouTube. Thank you for taking time out to be with us and engaging us, the speakers with your exciting questions. A big shout out to Team The Indian Futures, Prafullit, Abhishek, Vanshika, Subhranshu for their selfless and untiring efforts to make today's town hall and the TIF an exciting, wonderful journey. Please stay safe. Please stay connected with us through our social media. I assure you, we will up the game with every single endeavor of ours in the weeks and months ahead. Wishing you all a very happy and safe Diwali. Wear mask and do social distancing. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. Thank you, Professor Ganguly. Great to have you.
Thank you,
Thanks
everybody.
very much.
Happy
Thanks, Professor
Diwali.
Mattoo. Thank you.
Happy Diwali to my
Happy Diwali.
colleagues.
Thank you.
Happy Diwali.
Everyone.
Stay safe.
Thank you.